The sound of the microphone feedback sliced through the soft garden music like a serrated blade. I was standing under an arch of 2,000 hand-tied white roses, my hand trembling slightly in Julian's firm, steady grip. We had just been pronounced husband and wife. The air smelled like expensive perfume and fresh-cut grass, a perfect June afternoon that cost us 2 years of savings. But as my mother, Eleanor Vance, stepped onto the podium and wrenched the mic from the terrified MC, the warmth drained from the sunlight. She wasn't wearing the soft pastel mother-of-the-bride dress we had agreed on. She was in crimson, a deep, blood-red silk that made her look like a wound in the middle of all that white. She didn't look at the 250 guests. She looked directly at me with eyes that were as cold as a frozen lake. "My daughter is a liar," she said. Her voice didn't shake. It was resonant, clear, and carried by the speakers to every corner of the estate. The laughter died. The clinking of champagne glasses stopped. My bouquet was still heavy in my hand, the lilies and baby's breath mocking me with their purity. I stood there, frozen in a designer gown that felt like a shroud, while my own mother told our entire world that I was a fraud. She told them I had trapped Julian. She told them I had forged my financial history, and that everything they thought they knew about Alara Vance was a calculated deception designed to bleed the Thorne family dry. My mascara hadn't even begun to run yet, but inside, I was crumbling into dust. What Eleanor didn't know was that Julian wasn't the victim she was claiming him to be. My husband is a risk assessment consultant, a man who spends his life following digital breadcrumbs and unmasking corporate ghosts. For 8 months, he had been quietly, surgically investigating the woman standing at that podium. What he found in those encrypted files and forged bank statements would shatter 15 years of my mother's carefully constructed lies in less than 5 minutes. Before this night was over, 6 of our closest relatives would walk out of this garden in tears, not because of what I had done, but because they finally realized they had been her prey all along. Before I reveal exactly how we dismantled her empire of lies right there on the dance floor, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story is hitting home for you. I also really want to know who is with me right now. Where are you watching this from? And what time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know you're here. The silence that followed my mother's opening statement was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It was the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I looked out at the sea of faces, my cousins, my coworkers, Julian's elite business partners, and I saw the shift. It was a physical movement, a collective leaning away from me. Suspicion is a virus, and my mother was the primary carrier. She stood there, regal and righteous, clutching the microphone as if it were a holy relic. She was a master of the performance, a woman who had spent my entire childhood playing the role of the self-sacrificing single mother while she slowly drained the life and the bank accounts of everyone around her. Julian's hand never left mine. In fact, he squeezed it tighter. I could feel the heat radiating from him, a calm, controlled energy that was the total opposite of the chaos exploding in my chest. He didn't look shocked. He looked like a man who had been waiting for a specific piece of data to arrive, and it just had. He looked up at Eleanor, his face a mask of professional neutrality. He didn't interrupt her. He let her speak. He gave her all the rope she needed to hang herself. Eleanor leaned into the mic, her voice dropping to a theatrical, wounded whisper. I begged her to be honest with you, Julian. I told her that a marriage built on a foundation of debt and stolen identities couldn't survive. But she chose this. She chose the spectacle over the truth. She looked at the crowd, her hand pressed to her heart in that gesture she had perfected over decades of manipulation. I am doing this because I love her, because a mother's job is to protect her children from their own worst impulses. I felt the blood rushing in my ears. I wanted to scream that it wasn't true. I wanted to tell them about the 4 secret accounts Julian found linked to my Social Security number. I wanted to tell them about the inheritance from my grandfather that supposedly vanished into medical bills, but actually paid for the very house she was living in. But my throat was locked. I was the little girl again. The one who was told she was bad with money, the one who was told she was irresponsible, the one who was told she was lucky, her mother was there to catch her. The garden lights flickered on as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the grass. My mother stood at the center of that light, basking in the horror she had created. She thought she had won. She thought she had destroyed my new life before the first dance. She had no idea that Julian was reaching into his jacket pocket for his phone, and that the projector we had set up for our wedding slideshow was about to display something much more permanent than photos of our first vacation. The trap was set, but Eleanor Vance was the one walking right into the center of it. The silence in the garden after Eleanor's outburst was a vacuum, sucking the air right out of my lungs. I looked at her, standing there in that crimson dress, and for a split second, I wasn't a 31-year-old bride standing under a rose arch. I was 6 years old again, standing in our old sun-drenched kitchen, holding a $5 bill my uncle had given me for my birthday. I remember her hand reaching out, palm up, not with a smile, but with that look of weary, practiced concern she wore like a second skin. "Give it to me, Alara," she had said. "You will just lose it. You have always been so careless with things that matter." That was the seed, bad with money. It is a phrase that became the permanent soundtrack of my life, a label stitched into the lining of my identity. It wasn't based on a math test I had failed or a bill I had forgotten to pay. It was a truth handed down from on high, unquestioned and absolute. Eleanor Vance didn't just manage our household, she was the supreme auditor of my soul. Every cent that touched my palm was redirected into her safekeeping. Since I was old enough to hold a dollar bill, she controlled every cent. When I got my first summer job at 16, she was there at the front door the moment I got my paycheck. "Give it to me," she would say. "I will put it somewhere safe for you, baby. You will just waste it on nonsense." And I believed her. I believed her the way you believe the sky is blue or the grass is green. You don't ask for proof from your own mother. You don't ask for receipts when you are told you are being protected. When I was 18, the world shifted in a way that should have set me free, but only tightened the leash. My grandfather, Arthur Sterling, passed away. He was a man of quiet, immense strength, a retired architect who always smelled of cedarwood shavings and expensive black coffee. He was the only person in my life who looked at me and didn't see a dreamer or a liability. He saw a partner. He would slip me $20 bills when Eleanor wasn't looking, calling me a Lara girl and telling me to buy the good charcoal for my sketches. After the funeral, while the house was still heavy with the scent of lilies and the suffocating weight of grief, I finally worked up the courage to ask, "Mom, did Grandpa leave anything for us? For me or Maya?" She didn't even blink. She was sitting at the mahogany dining table, sorting through a stack of hospital papers with a sigh that sounded like a collapsing building. "Alara, honey," she said, her voice dripping with a pity that felt like cold lead. Grandpa was a wonderful man, but he wasn't a wealthy one. Between the hospital stays and the end-of-life care, there was barely enough left to cover the funeral costs. You know he wasn't a man of means. I felt a wave of guilt so sudden and sharp it made my stomach turn. How could I be so selfish? How could I ask about an inheritance when my mother was supposedly drowning in debt to bury her own father? I never saw a will. I never asked again. I buried my curiosity in the same dirt as Grandpa Arthur. By the time I was 22, I had moved out into a studio apartment that was barely larger than a parking spot. I was working 12-hour days as a freelance architect, poring over blueprints until my eyes burned. Because I had been told my whole life that I was irresponsible, I became obsessed with tracking my finances. I kept a physical notebook, a paper one, where I wrote down the price of every loaf of bread and every bus fare. I was the most disciplined person I knew, yet the numbers in my bank account never made sense. Money would appear from a client deposit and then seemingly evaporate. Small withdrawals I couldn't explain would appear like jagged holes in a safety net. I would call the bank, get transferred through 3 different departments, and eventually give up out of sheer exhaustion. I told myself what my mother had always told me. You are just not good with money, Alara. I was a professional woman designing buildings for other people, yet I was terrified of my own bank portal. Whenever I reached a breaking point and asked Eleanor for advice, or wondered why things felt so unfair, she had her skeleton key ready. She would cry. Every single time. After everything I sacrificed as a single mother to give you a life, you are accusing me of being the problem? That sentence could end any conversation. It was her ultimate weapon, and it slammed every door shut. The most painful part was watching the double standard play out with my younger sister, Maya. While I was eating rice 4 nights a week and wearing shoes with soles so thin I could feel the cold pavement, Maya was living a different version of reality. Mom paid for her entire college tuition. Mom bought her a used car for her 20th birthday and took her on expensive shopping trips for designer clothes. When I finally asked why I didn't get the same help, Eleanor had her answer polished and ready. Maya is responsible, Alara. You are not. You would just squander it. I swallowed that medicine year after year. I thought I deserved the struggle. I thought my poverty was a character flaw that I had inherited from my father. I sat in that garden at my wedding, listening to her call me a liar, and I realized that for 15 years she had been the one writing the script. She had turned the relatives against me, telling them I was difficult and ungrateful. She had told our neighbors that I was the reason she was struggling. She had built a fortress of lies and kept me trapped inside it, convinced that I was the one who couldn't be trusted. I looked at Julian, the man who had spent months unearthing the truth I was too afraid to see. I realized that the woman in the crimson dress wasn't protecting me. She was harvesting me. The auditor who had spent my entire life telling me I couldn't handle the truth was the only one who had been afraid of it all along. The rainy Tuesday in October I met Julian Thorne was the day the carefully constructed walls of my reality began to crack. I was 29 years old, sitting in a cramped coffee shop downtown, nursing a lukewarm latte and staring at my paper notebook. My freelance client had just flaked on me for the 3rd time that month, and I was frantically recalculating my bus fare and grocery budget, trying to figure out how I would make it to Friday. I felt that familiar, cold knot of shame in my chest, the one my mother Eleanor had planted there years ago. I was just bad with money. I was a dreamer, an architect who could build castles in the sky but couldn't keep $20 in her wallet. That was when I noticed the man in the corner booth. He didn't have a coffee. He had a laptop open and 3 different colored highlighters in his hand, moving across a stack of papers with the kind of intensity people usually reserve for crime scenes. When I accidentally caught his eye, he didn't look away. He smiled, a genuine sort of smile that made me feel, for a split second, like I wasn't invisible. "Sorry about the mess," he said, gesturing to the spreadsheets. "Numbers don't like to behave today." I laughed, a bit too loudly because I was nervous, and he invited me to sit closer so he didn't have to shout across the room. Julian was a risk assessment consultant, a forensic specialist for an independent auditing firm. His entire career was built on one principle: following money that doesn't want to be found. Over our next few dates, I found myself fascinated by the way he looked at the world. To Julian, everything was a balance sheet. He didn't care about what people said. He cared about what the data showed. But as our relationship deepened, that professional lens began to turn toward me, and what he saw didn't match the story I had been told my whole life. It happened on a Friday night, about 4 months into our relationship. We were at my tiny apartment, and I was making rice and beans for the 4th night in a row. I had turned down a dinner invitation at a nice Italian place because I told him I was having a tight month. Julian sat at my small kitchen table, watching me meticulously measure out the grain. "Alara," he said softly, his voice patient but firm, "I've been watching you for months. You budget everything. You track every utility bill, every grocery run, every bus pass down to the single cent. You have more financial discipline than most of my corporate clients." I shrugged, looking away. "I'm just trying to compensate for being irresponsible," I said, repeating Eleanor's script. "My mom says I'm lucky she's there to help me manage things, or I'd be on the street." Julian didn't look convinced. He set his fork down and looked me straight in the eyes. "That doesn't add up, Alara. You haven't bought yourself new shoes in 2 years. Your winter coat has a broken zipper you've pinned shut. You work 60 hours a week at a successful firm. You aren't bad with money. You are someone who never has enough, and as an auditor, I can tell you that those are 2 very different problems. I don't understand where the money is going. The first time Julian met my mother, I thought the air in the room might actually freeze. Eleanor had gone all out for the Sunday dinner. She'd cooked a roast, set the table with the good Sterling family china, and lit candles. She wore her best smile, the one that usually made people trust her instantly. For the first hour, she was the picture of a devoted, self-sacrificing mother. She asked Julian about his family, complimented his career, and laughed at his stories. But then, she took a long sip of her wine and leaned in. Alara has always been such a dreamer, Julian, she said, her voice dripping with that theatrical, wounded pity. She's not really a doer, you know? Head in the clouds. I'm just glad she has me to keep her feet on the ground. Julian didn't even flinch. Actually, he said, his voice level and measured. Alara built her freelance architecture business from the ground up while working a full-time job. That takes an incredible amount of discipline and grit. I'd call that a doer. The shift in Eleanor's eyes was instantaneous. The warmth vanished, replaced by a cold, hard stare that felt like a door slamming shut. Well, a mother sees things a partner doesn't, I'm sure, she snapped, clearing the plates with a little too much force. That night, she called me at 11 o'clock. I don't trust him, Alara. He's after something. Men like that, so smooth and educated, they always want something. I tried to defend him, but she hung up on me, leaving me trembling in the dark. Julian didn't push me, but he also didn't let go. A few weeks later, he mentioned something that made my stomach drop. Your mom asked me what I do 4 different times that night, Alara. And every time I said the words forensic accounting or risk assessment, she changed the subject immediately. She looked uncomfortable, like those words were physically painful to hear. I told him he was overthinking it, but Julian was the kind of man who couldn't leave a number out of place. He began to look into things, not because he wanted to control me, but because the forensic accountant in him knew a red flag when he saw one. He started with the public records. He spent nights at his kitchen table, illuminated by the blue light of his laptop, searching through the county probate filings. He found my grandfather Arthur Sterling's name. He tracked down the attorney who had handled the estate, a retired man named Donald Fletcher. Julian didn't tell me what he was doing at first. He wanted to be sure. He wanted to have the data before he presented me with a truth he knew would break my heart. What Julian was finding was a trail of digital breadcrumbs that led straight to my mother's doorstep. He found a joint savings account opened when I was 17, one I had never even known existed, linked to my Social Security number. He saw withdrawals that matched exactly with the dates Eleanor had told me the hospital bills were due after Grandpa Arthur died. But most importantly, he found a version of a will that looked very different from the one Eleanor had shown the family. As he sat there in the quiet of his office, Julian realized he wasn't just falling in love with me. He was building a case against the woman who raised me. He realized that the math of my life had been rigged from the start, and he was the only one with the tools to balance the scales. The letter arrived on a Thursday, just 2 days after Julian had slid a diamond ring onto my finger. It looked like any other piece of junk mail, a plain white envelope with the logo of a bank I hadn't used in years. But as I opened it at the kitchen table, the words on the page didn't make sense. It was a formal notice stating that a savings account held in my name had been closed at the request of the joint account holder. The remaining balance was 0. My stomach did a slow, nauseating roll. I didn't own a joint account. I hadn't used that bank since I was a teenager. I called the number on the back of the letter immediately. My hands were shaking so hard I nearly dropped my phone. When the representative picked up, I explained that there must be a mistake. I told her I didn't request a closure because I didn't even know the account existed. There was a long silence on the other end, the sound of typing, and then a soft, cautious voice. Mom, this account was opened in August of 2013. You were 17. The cosigner is listed as Eleanor Vance. My breath caught. August 2013 was the month my grandfather Arthur Sterling passed away. It was the month my mother told me we were broke. I asked for the balance history, my voice cracking. The representative told me she couldn't give me the full history over the phone, But she could confirm one thing: the closing balance of $125,000 had been withdrawn in a single transaction 3 days ago. One day after I told my mother I was getting married. If you are feeling a cold chill down your spine right now, if you have ever felt that sickening moment when a person you loved turned into a stranger, then you are not alone. This is why I share this. I want to know if you have ever had to face a truth that felt like it would break you. What would you say to someone who stole your peace? Tell me in the comments where you are watching from and how this makes you feel. And if you believe that no one should have to fight for the truth alone, please hit that subscribe button. It helps us keep the light on these stories. That night, Julian didn't say a word when I handed him the letter. He didn't look surprised. He looked like an architect watching a building collapse exactly the way he predicted it would. He sat me down, made me a cup of tea I couldn't drink, and asked for everything. He wanted every login, every old statement, every scrap of paper I had ever kept in my physical notebook. He worked until 3 a.m. I fell asleep on the sofa, drifting off to the rhythmic click of his mouse. When I woke up, the sun was just beginning to gray the edges of the curtains. Julian was still at the table, but the man I knew was gone. In his place was the forensic auditor, cold and precise. "Alara," he said, his voice like gravel, "it is worse than we thought. There aren't just 1 or 2 accounts. There are 4. 4 separate bank accounts linked to your Social Security number that you never opened. They have been systematically drained over the last 12 years. Every time you got a raise, every time you had a good freelance month, the money was being siphoned off. I felt like I was floating outside my own body. 12 years of eating rice and beans. 12 years of wearing boots with holes in the soles. 12 years of Eleanor telling me I was bad with money while she was using my identity as her own personal ATM. Julian reached across the table and took my hand. "We need to find the source," he said. "This much money doesn't just appear. It started with your grandfather." Julian spent the next week tracking down the man who had been my grandfather's shadow, Donald Fletcher. He was a retired attorney living in a small, wood-paneled house filled with the scent of old paper and pipe tobacco. When Julian showed him my grandfather's name, the old man remembered everything. Arthur Sterling was a meticulous man, Fletcher told him. He wanted to make sure his girls were taken care of. He didn't trust the way Eleanor handled things, even back then. Fletcher pulled a dusty file from a locked cabinet and laid it on the table. It was the original last will and testament of Arthur Sterling. Julian scanned the pages, his eyes widening. There it was, in black and white. Grandpa Arthur had left a trust fund of $250,000. It was meant to be split equally between me and my sister Maya. We were supposed to receive our shares when we turned 21. But then Julian pulled up a photo of the document Eleanor had shown the family years ago. It was a crude, forged version that claimed all assets were to be left to Eleanor Vance for the management and care of the family. She had changed the font, altered the dates, and forged the signatures. She hadn't just lied. She had committed a felony to ensure that we stayed dependent on her. The most crushing blow came when Julian mapped out the timeline of the missing $125,000, my half of the trust. It had been sitting in that joint account, untouched, for years. My mother had kept it there like a trophy. But the moment Julian entered the picture, the moment she realized she was losing her grip on me, she panicked. She didn't just take the money because she needed it. She took it because she wanted to make sure I had nothing to build a life with. She wanted me to fail so I would have to crawl back to her. I sat there in our kitchen, surrounded by the wreckage of my childhood, looking at the man who had saved me without even being asked. I realized then that my mother had spent my entire life trying to convince me I was small, so that I would never realize how much she was stealing from me. She had gambled our relationship, my future, and her own soul for a pile of cash and the power to keep me quiet. But as Julian closed his laptop and looked at me with those steady, kind eyes, I knew the silence was over. The math didn't lie, and for the first time in 31 years, neither would I. The weight of the bank statements Julian had uncovered felt like a physical pressure against my chest, but we both knew that on their own, they might not be enough. In the world of high-stakes auditing and legal battles, paper can be explained away, but a confession is absolute. Julian sat me down in our quiet living room, the glow of his laptop casting long, sharp shadows against the wall. He explained that we lived in a one-party consent state, a legal technicality that meant I could record a conversation without the other person's knowledge, and it would be fully admissible in a court of law. I knew the law, but I didn't know if I had the stomach for the execution. I was about to set a trap for my own mother. It took me 3 days to find the courage to pick up the phone. I sat on our bedroom floor, the carpet feeling rough and cold against my skin. Julian was in the kitchen, close enough to be a tether if I started to drift away into the old patterns of fear, but far enough to give me the space to find my own voice. My hands were shaking so violently that I had to grip the phone with both palms just to keep it steady. I stared at her name on the screen, Eleanor, the woman who had raised me, the woman who had also been methodically erasing my future for over a decade. I pressed call. She picked up on the second ring, her voice bright and sharp. Alara, honey, what a surprise. I took a shallow breath, trying to keep the tremor out of my throat. Mom, I was looking through some old family papers and I just had a question. Did Grandpa Arthur ever leave anything for me and Maya? There was a pause, a split second where the air on the other end of the line seemed to vanish. I already told you, Alara, she answered, and her voice had that familiar edge now, the one that warned me not to push. He barely left enough to cover the funeral costs. You know how expensive the end-of-life care was? I closed my eyes, leaning my head against the bed frame, but someone mentioned there might have been a trust, I whispered. The shift was instantaneous. Who told you that? Her voice sharpened into a blade. Was it Julian? Is he filling your head with this nonsense again? I told you he was dangerous, Alara. He's trying to drive a wedge between us. Then came the weapon she had used on me my entire life, the softening. Her tone dropped into that low, theatrical, maternal warmth that used to make me feel so guilty for ever doubting her. Baby, I am the truth, she said softly. Everything I did, every choice I made was to protect you and your sister. Protect us from what, Mom? I asked, and for the first time, I didn't back down. Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I could hear her breathing, heavy, rhythmic, calculated. Then she said the words that shattered the last remaining pieces of my childhood. I was protecting you from making the same mistakes I made. Your grandfather's money would have ruined you, Alara. You've never been responsible. It would have gone to waste. I was saving you from yourself. I nearly dropped the phone. She had said it. Not that the money didn't exist, not that it was gone, but that she had withheld it because she deemed me unworthy. She had confirmed the trust, the forgery, and the theft in a single, self-righteous sentence. She had recorded her own confession without even knowing it. I ended the call without saying goodbye and set the phone on the carpet. Julian appeared in the doorway almost immediately. He didn't say anything. He just came over and sat on the floor beside me, pulling me into a silent, steady embrace. She admitted it. I whispered into his shoulder. She spent it on herself because she thought it would ruin me. With the recording secured, Julian's professional instincts took over. The next 2 months were a whirlwind of meticulous preparation. He wasn't just my fiancé anymore. He was a commander preparing for a siege. He spent every evening at the dining table, organizing what he called the evidence package. He made digital copies of everything. The original Will Julian had recovered from the attorney Donald Fletcher, the forged version Eleanor had used, the bank records showing the systematic siphoning of my accounts, and finally, the audio file of our conversation. Julian was a man who believed in redundancies. He sent copies to our lawyer, Patricia Sinclair, and uploaded everything to a secure cloud backup. He even kept 2 physical hard drives in a locked safe. If anything ever goes sideways, Alara, we are covered from every angle, he told me. He wasn't just protecting our money, he was protecting the truth. He wanted to make sure that when the mask finally fell, there would be no way for her to put it back on. In the midst of this cold, calculated preparation, something strange happened. Eleanor, perhaps sensing that she was losing her grip, or perhaps fueled by the massive withdrawal she had just made from my account, suddenly became the perfect mother. She started calling me with caterer recommendations. She offered to handle the seating charts for the 250 guests. She sent me photos of centerpieces and offered to host a bridal brunch. I watched her through the lens of the evidence Julian had gathered, and it was like watching a master class in manipulation. She was warm, engaged, and seemingly thrilled for the wedding. There is a part of every daughter, no matter how deeply she has been betrayed, that wants to believe her mother is capable of unconditional love. For a few weeks, I let myself fall into the trap. I let her help. I let her in. Julian watched from the sidelines, his eyes filled with a quiet, watchful readiness. He didn't stop me, but he made sure the package was always within reach. The final piece of Eleanor's plan fell into place 10 days before the wedding. She called me, her voice sounding uncharacteristically small. "Alara, I have one request. Just one. I'd like to give a toast at the reception, a mother's tribute to her eldest daughter. It would mean the world to me." I looked at Julian across the kitchen counter. He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. I said yes. I gave the wolf the keys to the hen house, and I had no idea that she was planning to use that microphone to try and destroy my life one last time. But Julian was ready. He had prepared the projector, he had tested the speakers, and he had the truth tucked into the inside pocket of his wedding suit. The stage was set for a confrontation that no one in that garden would ever forget. The word trapped hung in the humid June air like a thick, suffocating fog. I could hear a spoon clatter against a porcelain plate somewhere in the back of the garden, the sound echoing in the sudden, absolute silence of 250 people. My mother, Eleanor Vance, stepped down from the podium with the practiced grace of a queen, smoothing her crimson dress and taking a slow, deliberate sip of water. She didn't look at me. She looked at the crowd with a mask of tragic righteousness, the perfect portrait of a mother who had just performed a painful but necessary surgery on her daughter's life. My fingers were numb around my silk napkin, and I felt as if the entire estate was tilting on its axis. But then the weight on my hand shifted. Julian didn't let go. He didn't look like a victim, and he certainly didn't look angry. He looked exactly like the man I met in that coffee shop, a man who lived for the moment when the data finally reveals the truth. He leaned in close, his voice a steady anchor in the chaos. "Do you trust me?" he whispered. I nodded, and for the first time in 31 years, I felt the old ropes of my mother's manipulation begin to fray. Julian stood up slowly, adjusting his jacket with a calm, clinical precision that seemed to draw the oxygen out of Eleanor's lungs. He didn't run to the microphone. He didn't shout. He walked to the podium with the same rhythmic, heavy step he used when he was about to present a forensic audit to a board of directors. The room watched him, a sea of confused, judging faces. He reached into his inside jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. "I appreciate Eleanor's concern," he said into the mic, his voice even and level, built to hold weight. "She is right about one thing. There are things many of you don't know. But the person who's been lying, it's not Alara." Julian didn't wait for a response. He connected his phone to the projector we had set up for the wedding slideshow. The screen behind him, framed by those white roses and fairy lights, flickered to life. My mother's face went white as a sheet. 2 documents appeared side by side, illuminated in high definition for every guest to see. On the left was the original last will and testament of Arthur Sterling, filed in 2012 and verified by his attorney, Donald Fletcher. It clearly established a trust of $250,000, split equally between me and Maya. Julian pointed to the right side of the screen. "And this," he said, his voice cold as ice, "is the version Eleanor showed the family after Arthur's death. This one says, and I'm quoting, 'All assets to Eleanor Vance for the management and care of the family.'" A murmur broke through the tables like a crack in a dam. "These 2 documents are not the same," Julian continued. "One of them is real. One of them is a forgery designed to steal $125,000 from a 17-year-old girl." Aunt Beatrice stood up so fast her chair screeched against the wooden floor. Her napkin fell to the grass, but she didn't notice. She was staring at the screen, her eyes wide, with a horror that had been a decade in the making. Eleanor tried to shout over the noise, her voice high and ragged. "He's making this up! Those are fabrications!" But Julian wasn't finished. Those words landed like stones in still water. He tapped a button on his phone, and a progress bar appeared on the screen. Suddenly, the reception speakers weren't playing jazz. They were playing the sound of a daughter's heart breaking. My voice came first, asking about the money. Then came the shift, the softening of Eleanor's voice. And then the confession that split the night in half. Your grandfather's money would have ruined you, Alara. I was saving you from yourself. The audio stopped, and the silence that followed was even more terrifying than the recording. I could hear the ice shifting in a glass 3 tables away. Eleanor was standing by her chair now, her knuckles white as she gripped the back of it. It was taken out of context, she screamed. But Julian didn't flinch. There are 7 minutes of context on this recording, Eleanor. Would you like me to play all of it? The fallout was like a series of falling dominoes. Aunt Beatrice stepped out from behind her table, her hands trembling. Eleanor, you told me you were struggling. You took $45,000 from me to pay for Maya's tuition because you said the estate was empty. Then Uncle Silas spoke from his chair, his voice low and hoarse, like the words had been lodged in his throat for years. You pushed me off the trust, Eleanor. You said Dad didn't trust me to handle the money. I believed you for 12 years. One by one, the confessions began to pull from the room, each one a separate wound. Eleanor had covered with a smile. 6 of our closest family members, including Aunt Beatrice and Uncle Silas, left the reception in tears. They didn't leave because of me. They left because they saw their own reflections on that projector screen. They were all her victims. I don't remember deciding to stand, but suddenly I was on my feet. I walked toward my mother slowly, past the glowing fake will and the echo of her own voice. I stopped 3 feet from her. Mom, I said, and my voice was finally steady. For 29 years, you told me I was bad with money. I wasn't. You were taking it. She opened her mouth to speak, to spin one last lie, but I didn't let her. You said Julian was after something. He was. He was after the truth. I took the deepest breath of my life. I'm not going to scream, I said, loud enough for the remaining guests to hear. I'm going to do something you never expected. I'm going to walk away and let the truth speak for itself. As I turned my back on her and walked back to my husband, I realized that Eleanor Vance had given me the worst gift a mother could give at a wedding. But Julian had given me the best, the freedom to never be quiet again. No one applauded and no one needed to. The silence said everything. The recording ended, but the silence that followed was even more terrifying. It was the kind of silence that doesn't just sit in the air. It rings in your ears, high and piercing. I could hear the distant sound of a car horn from the main road and the soft clinking of ice in someone's forgotten glass 3 tables away. The fairy lights above us, which had seemed so magical an hour ago, now felt like tiny, mocking eyes watching the wreckage of my family. Julian's phone was still connected to the projector, and the image of the 2 wills, the truth and the lie, glowed against the white roses of the altar like a neon sign for a crime scene. The mask didn't just slip from my mother's face. It shattered. Eleanor Vance stood by her chair, her knuckles white as she gripped the back of it, her breathing ragged. But before she could even form her first excuse, the dominoes began to fall. It started with Aunt Beatrice. She had been standing since Julian first showed the dichuk, her hand over her mouth. Now, she stepped out from behind her table, her voice loud and trembling with a decade's worth of suppressed confusion. Eleanor, you told me you were struggling. Aunt Beatrice's voice cracked, and I could see the tears starting to spill over. You told me the estate was empty and that Alara was wasting whatever was left. I took out a second mortgage to give you $45,000 because you said it was the only way to pay for Alara's tuition. I stood there, frozen. I had worked 3 jobs to pay for my own classes while eating instant noodles in a studio apartment the size of a closet. I never saw a cent of that $45,000. Eleanor's head snapped toward her sister, her eyes wild and frantic. Beatrice, sit down. You don't know the whole story. You're being dramatic. But Beatrice didn't sit. She looked at me, then back at the screen, and the realization hit her like a physical blow. I almost lost my house for you, Eleanor, she whispered. And all this time you were sitting on Alara's trust? Then Uncle Silas stood up. He didn't shout. He was a man of quiet dignity, much like our grandfather Arthur, and that made his anger feel even more dangerous. His voice was low and hoarse, like the words had been lodged in his throat for 11 years. You pushed me off the trust, Eleanor. You told me Dad didn't trust me to handle the money because of my divorce. You told me he wanted you to have sole control because you were the only responsible one left. He shook his head slowly, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated disappointment. I believed you. I've carried that guilt since the funeral, thinking my own father died doubting me. And it was all a game to get the administrator seat, wasn't it? The garden was no longer a wedding venue. It was an auditorium for a trial. One by one, the people who had looked at me with pity or suspicion for years began to stand. Cousin Robert from 2 tables back stood up, his face flushed with a mix of anger and shame. You borrowed my car in 2019, Eleanor. You said you needed it for 2 weeks to get Alara to her interviews because she was too broke to fix her own. You told me it was totaled in a parking lot, and you cried so hard I didn't even file a claim because I felt bad for you. I never knew Alara had over $100,000 in an account you were hiding. If you are watching this right now and you can feel your heart racing, if you've ever discovered that someone you trusted, someone in your own family, had been weaving a web of lies around you for years, I want you to know something. You are not alone. This is the moment where the gaslighting ends and the truth begins. I want to hear from you. If you were sitting in that garden, what would you say to a woman who stole not just money, but years of peace from her own children? Tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what your reaction would be. And if you believe that accountability is the only way to heal, please hit that subscribe button. We are just getting to the part where the empire truly falls. The fallout was visceral. It wasn't just words. It was the sound of a family's foundation crumbling in real time. My sister Maya, who had always been the golden child, the one Eleanor used to show me what responsibility looked like, was sobbing into her hands. She looked up at Eleanor, her mascara finally running in dark streaks down her face. Mom, is my tuition account real? Or did you take from me too? Eleanor spun toward her youngest daughter, her voice sharp and desperate. Don't you dare turn on me, Maya. I did everything for you. But Maya didn't back down. She stood up and walked past Eleanor without looking at her, her phone clutched to her chest. She was the first of the 6 to leave. Aunt Beatrice followed, her husband's arm around her shoulders as she cried into her lace handkerchief. Then Uncle Silas, walking with the heavy, weary gait of a man who had just realized his sister was a stranger. Cousin Robert, Uncle Silas's wife, and Eleanor's oldest friend, Linda, all followed. They didn't leave because they hated Eleanor in that moment. They left because they couldn't stand to look at the person they had become while believing her. They were ashamed. They were grieving. They had all been victims of the same warm smile and the same wounded mother act that had kept me in a cage for 15 years. I watched them go, 6 of the people I loved most, walking out of my wedding in tears. The garden felt suddenly hollowed out. The fairy lights flickered, and for the first time in my life, I saw Eleanor Vance without her mask. She stood alone in the center of that beautiful, expensive garden, her crimson dress looking like a stain against the white roses. She was surrounded by 200 witnesses and the glowing evidence of her own greed. She looked small. She looked cornered. And most importantly, she looked like someone who had finally run out of moves. The silence that followed their departure wasn't empty. It was heavy with the weight of justice finally starting to lean in the right direction. I turned to Julian, and for the first time that day, I wasn't afraid of what the numbers would say. I knew that the truth didn't just balance the books, it set me free. The silence that followed the wedding wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of a house after a fire. 3 days after the garden estate emptied, I found myself sitting in a law office on the 4th floor of a downtown building. The air smelled like old paper and expensive floor wax. My attorney, Clara Montgomery, was a woman who didn't believe in small talk. She had silver hair, reading glasses on a chain, and 22 years of experience in dismantling financial predators. She sat across from Julian and me, opening the manila folder that Julian had spent months preparing. We sat in silence for 11 minutes as she read through the bank statements, the forged will, and the transcript of the recording. "You have a very strong case," Clara said, her voice clinical and cold. "The forged will alone is a criminal matter, but combined with the unauthorized accounts and the recorded admission, this is textbook financial exploitation." I flinched at that word. Exploitation. It felt too big, too dark to associate with the woman who used to tuck me in at night. But Julian put his hand on my knee under the desk, and I realized it was the only word that fit. I told Clara I didn't want prison for my mother. I just wanted what was mine. I wanted Maya to be protected, and I wanted Eleanor Vance removed from any legal authority over our lives permanently. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about accountability. Eleanor fought back with everything she had. Within 10 days, she hired a younger attorney and issued a statement to the rest of the family, calling me an ungrateful child attempting to commit elder abuse. It was her final performance, but it only lasted 72 hours. Once her own lawyer reviewed the evidence Julian had gathered, the forensic accounting report, and the authenticated original will from the retired attorney, he told her plainly to settle. There was no defense for a forged signature. There was no explanation for $125,000 vanishing the day after an engagement announcement. The civil case took 4 months, but for me, it felt like 4 years of holding my breath. The ruling was straightforward. Eleanor was ordered to return the full trust amount of $250,000 plus accrued interest, totaling nearly $300,000 to be split between Maya and me. To pay us back, Eleanor was forced to sell the one thing she prized above all else, her apartment. It was a luxury space worth $420,000, with the designer kitchen and the paved balcony where she used to host Easter brunches. It was a home she had purchased 6 years ago with the very money she had stolen from our grandfather's dying wishes. I watched the moving trucks from a distance as she transitioned to a small, one-bedroom apartment on the east side of town. There was no backyard there, no paved driveway, and no more status to hide behind. Aunt Beatrice and Uncle Silas filed their own claims for the money she had borrowed under false pretenses, and the court ensured every debt was accounted for. Eleanor was permanently removed from any fiduciary role involving family assets. The numbers didn't lie, and for the first time in my life, neither did the law. But the real healing didn't come from a court order or a bank transfer. It came 3 weeks later, during the estate sale of Eleanor's old apartment. Julian had gone back to help oversee the final inventory when he found a small, dusty box tucked behind a false panel in the back of her closet. Inside, among old photos and tax returns, was a yellowed envelope with my name written on the front. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was blocky and slanted, the penmanship of a man who spent 50 years holding a carpenter's pencil instead of a pen. It was a letter from my grandfather, Arthur Sterling. Eleanor had kept it hidden for 12 years. She had stolen his last words to me, just as she had stolen the money he left behind. I opened the letter alone in our bedroom, my hands trembling as the paper crackled. Inside was a single page of lined notebook paper. "Alara, girl," it began, "you have got more heart than anyone I know. Don't let anyone tell you different. I set something aside for you and Maya, so you would both have a good start. Your mama will take care of it until you are ready. I love you, sweetheart. Don't ever forget that. Grandpa Arthur." I held that letter against my chest and cried so hard that I couldn't breathe. It wasn't because of the money. It was because the one person I had loved most in the world had seen me. He hadn't seen a dreamer who was bad with money or a liability who needed to be controlled. He saw a girl with a strong heart who was ready for the world. Eleanor had spent over a decade trying to convince me I was small, but Grandpa Arthur had left me the truth. A week later, I met Maya at the same coffee shop where I first met Julian. We sat in that same corner booth, and for the first time, there was no filter between us. Maya told me how Eleanor had played us against each other for years, telling her I was jealous of her and telling me she was the only responsible one. We were two sisters who had grown up under the same roof but were kept miles apart by design. We reached across the table and took each other's hands, realizing that we weren't just regaining our inheritance, we were regaining our sisterhood. I am 31 years old now, and I finally know exactly who I am. I have a small design studio above a bakery downtown, rented with a piece of the money that was always supposed to be mine. There is a framed print of a cardinal on the wall because Grandpa Arthur used to say they were visitors from people who love you. Julian is still Julian, steady, quiet, and still double-checking every receipt. I used to think strength meant keeping the peace and swallowing the truth to keep others comfortable. Now I know that strength is standing in a room full of people and choosing honesty, even when your voice shakes. My mother gave me the worst gift anyone could give at a wedding, but my husband and my grandfather gave me the best: the freedom to live a life that adds up. It has been 6 months since the morning I sat in that mahogany law office and signed the final papers to reclaim my life. The dust has finally settled on the legal battlefield, and for the first time in nearly 30 years, the air in my lungs feels clean. But the most important part of this journey didn't happen in a courtroom or a bank lobby. It happened on a rainy Tuesday afternoon at that same corner booth in the coffee shop where I first met Julian. I was there early, watching the steam rise from my latte, when the bell above the door chimed and my sister Maya walked in. She was already crying before she sat down. She reached across the table and grabbed my hand so hard her knuckles were white. "Alara, I am so sorry I didn't see it sooner," she whispered. Her voice broke on the words, and I realized then that she was a victim of our mother's architecture, just as much as I was. Eleanor had spent years telling Maya that I was jealous of her, that I was distant because I didn't want her around, and that I was irresponsible. She had played us like instruments in a dark symphony, keeping us apart by design so that we would never compare notes. We sat there for 2 hours, two sisters who had grown up under the same roof, but were finally meeting for the very first time. We aren't just rebuilding a relationship. We are discovering a sisterhood that was stolen from us. If you are listening to this and you feel a lump in your throat because you have a sibling or a family member you have been estranged from due to someone else's lies, please know that the first step is just showing up. If this story of reconciliation is touching your heart, please hit that like and subscribe button. It truly makes a difference in helping these stories of truth and healing reach the people who need them most. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had to bridge a gap with someone you love after the truth finally came out? I read every single one of your stories. 3 months after the wedding, a letter arrived in my mailbox. I recognized the handwriting immediately, the sharp, looping J and the slanted K. There was no return address. I opened it at my kitchen table while Julian was at work. It was only 4 sentences long. "Alara, you have destroyed this family. I hope you are proud of what you and that man have done. I will never forgive you. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the forged will or the stolen thousands. It was just Eleanor, still casting herself as the victim, still refusing to look in the mirror." I sat with that letter for an hour, letting the old grief wash over me one last time. Then I wrote back. I didn't scream, and I didn't use many words. I simply wrote, "Mom, I didn't destroy this family. The lies did. I don't hate you, but I will not let you hurt me again. If you ever want a relationship with me, it starts with the actual truth, not your version of it. Until then, I need space." I sealed it, stamped it, and walked it to the mailbox. I didn't wait for a response, and for the first time, I didn't feel guilty for protecting myself. Now, as I sit in my new studio, a small, bright space above a bakery downtown, I look around at a life that finally adds up. There is a drafting table by the window where the morning light hits just right. On the wall is a framed print of a cardinal. Julian gave it to me because Grandpa Arthur used to say cardinals were visitors from the people who love you. Maya comes by every Thursday now. We are learning how to be sisters without a filter between us. It's awkward sometimes, and we don't always agree, but we show up. That is the part that matters. Julian is still the same steady man I fell in love with. He still double-checks the grocery receipts and smiles when a number doesn't match a price tag. Last week, he caught a $3 error at the store, and I laughed until I couldn't breathe. Some things never change, and thank God for that. He didn't just give me a wedding. He gave me the truth, and he taught me that a real partner fights for your peace as hard as they fight for their own. I used to think strength meant keeping the peace. I thought it meant saying yes when I meant no and swallowing the truth to keep my mother comfortable. Now I know that strength is standing in a room full of people and choosing honesty even when your voice shakes. It is about setting a boundary and refusing to let anyone move it, even if they share your DNA. My name is Ilara Vance, and I finally know exactly who I am. Looking back on this entire journey, there are 3 lessons I want to leave you with, because I don't want anyone else to wait 30 years to learn them. First, if someone else controls your money, they control your life. Check your own accounts. Know your own numbers. Do not let anyone, no matter how much they claim to love you, keep you in the dark about your own value. Financial independence is the foundation of your freedom. Second, silence is not loyalty. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and your family is to speak up, even when everyone else would rather you stay quiet. A family built on secrets is a house built on sand. Third, the right partner will not just love the version of you that is easy to manage. They will love the truth of you, and they will stand beside you when you have to face the hardest parts of your past. If this story meant something to you today, if it gave you even a little bit of courage to look at a number that doesn't add up or a story that keeps changing in your own life, then my mission is complete. Please share your own experiences with setting boundaries in the comments below. Your words might be the lighthouse someone else needs to find their way out of the fog. There is another story waiting for you in the description, one about a hidden inheritance and a secret that changed a family forever. I think you will really connect with it. Click the link to watch it now. Thank you for being here, for listening to the truth, and for choosing to be part of this community. I will see you in the next story.